The room was a hollow shell of memory, walls yellowed by time, curtains stiff with dust, and the faint odor of rot lingering like a whisper that refused to die. Moonlight fractured through the broken blinds, cutting the darkness into uneven stripes that trembled across the peeling wallpaper. Somewhere, water dripped, a slow metronomic bleed from a rusted pipe that marked time's quiet cruelty. The air felt heavy, as though silence itself had been buried here, pressed deep into the bones of the place. Detective Rowan Vale stood in the threshold, his silhouette merging with the decay. He had been here before, not in body, but in dream, in the sleepless echo of years haunted by a case he never solved. The house had been vacant since 1979, when a girl vanished into the fog that rolled in from the coast and never rolled back out. Every detail now felt rehearsed by guilt. The warped floorboards, the faint outline of where a bed once stood, the scent of salt that shouldn't have been this far inland. He closed his eyes, and the silence grew teeth. The sea murmured somewhere far off, a distant reminder of the night she disappeared. The town had forgotten her name, buried the grief under newer tragedies. But Rowan hadn't. Even after decades, her absence still moved through him like a current. He had returned not for duty, not for justice, but because something inside him demanded to face the space where time had stopped. Every corner seemed to breathe, the shadows bending into the suggestion of movement. A mirror hung crooked on the far wall, its glass fractured into thin veins. And within its broken reflection he thought he saw her, fleeting, pale, and waiting. Old Disappearance resurfaces. After discovery of symbolic object, they found it buried behind the station house. Unearthed during renovation, a locket, tarnished and half filled with sand. Inside, the photograph of a young woman had blurred into abstraction, a face half erased by moisture. A smile that might have never been, the name etched faintly on the back, Evelyn Maren. Age 22, a journalism student who vanished on the night of her college graduation. Last seen leaving a party near the cliffs outside Monterey. Her car was found the next morning with one door open, keys still in the ignition, and a trail of footprints leading toward the fog, then nowhere. Rowan had been a rookie, then fresh, determined, still believing that truth could be extracted from the world if one asked the right questions. Evelyn was his first case and his last failure. Now, the locket sat under the harsh light of an evidence table, its reflection crawling up the metal like a wound reopening. Rowan's fingers hovered above it, but never touched. Some part of him feared that contact would blur the line between past and present, dream and confession. Why was it buried here? The young officer asked, her voice hesitant, barely piercing the hum of the fluorescent light. Rowan didn't answer. He didn't tell her that the station had once been a church, that Evelyn's father had been a deacon who'd helped convert it into police. Headquarters after the tragedy, as if holy ground could sanitize guilt. He didn't tell her about the letter Evelyn had mailed the night she vanished, addressed to him, but never delivered. Outside, the fog began to creep through the alleyways again. It moved like memory, inevitable, uninvited. Rowan stood by the window, staring at the reflection of the locket on the glass, and for a moment, it seemed to pulse like a living heart. Somewhere deep inside him, a door long sealed began to crack open. 3. Investigator shows personal involvement. Mixing duty with obsession, he began visiting the cliffs again, the same stretch of coastline where Evelyn's footprints had vanished into the mist. The Pacific was restless, gnawing endlessly at the rocks below, as if trying to swallow the memory of that night hole. Rowan would stand there for hours, staring into the grey expanse, until shapes began to form in the fog, fragments of her face, the glimmer of a dress, the shimmer of laughter carried by the wind. "Evelyn," he whispered once, not realizing he had spoken. The word dissolved instantly, devoured by the sea back in his apartment. The walls had become a shrine of unfinished thoughts. Old photographs, maps, and copies of Evelyn's articles, stories about small-town corruption, unspoken debts, and the fragility of truth, pinned with red thread, connecting everything and nothing. He slept beneath them like a man lying under stars that never moved. Each clue he uncovered pointed not outward but inward, reflecting some flaw, some omission from his own life. He found her voice in his old cassette tapes, interviews from the investigation, her mother's trembling account of the night she didn't come home, the sound of his own younger self asking questions that now felt cruel in their innocence. "You cared too much," the chief had told him years ago. "That's why you lost perspective." But perspective didn't matter now. The case had become personal long before it was cold. Evelyn had become something larger, not a victim, but a mirror of his own quiet decay. Each night he'd listen to the tapes again. Static would fade into her voice. Young, alive, curious. "Do you ever think truth is just what we agree to stop questioning?" He never remembered her saying that before. But then again, memory was a traitor. The line between remembrance and haunting had dissolved completely. People left behind moved through the story like breath fogging glass there. Then gone, then there again. Evelyn's mother, Evelyn Maren, kept a garden of drought-tolerant succulents, their spined rosettes catching light like small armored hearts. She answered the door in a sweater too big for her, sleeves chewed at the cuffs, hair pinned back with a clip that had lost its teeth. Rowan remembered her perfume from 79 Omond, and something powdery, and how it clung now to the corridor like a memory unwilling to be driven out by fresh paint. On the mantel, a candle melted in a steady slump. A quiet surrender. She had a way of making silence talk, Leda said, staring into the wick's black thorn. Evelyn could listen without making you feel listened to. "You understand?" A nod from him. She wrote things down I didn't think were there. Another nod. Her eyes flicked to his badge, as if it were a lie he'd chosen. "You keep coming back." "I keep coming back," he echoed, as if confessing to the house more than to her Pastor August. Reed once Deacon Reed met Rowan at the converted station. Beneath the chalk-smudged cruciform beams that people said were carpenter's braces, not relics. His illness had thinned him to an outline, every gesture a labor. He touched the locket, sealed in evidence, plastic, with a tremor that turned reverent at its edges. "I buried a daughter once," he murmured, eyes closing. "Not my own. But grief makes all fathers the same." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The young officer, Mara Chen, hovered nearby. Careful steps and careful questions, a nervous metronome in boots. She had a way of asking that implied she already knew, which made Rowan want to misremember out of spite for his younger self. "You were assigned to the case then?" she asked. "First month." He let the question hang. Silence. A room made of it. "Rowan," said a voice behind him. Elise, the woman who had left him 6 winters ago, arrived at his door with a grey scarf and a letter she had found among boxes he never unpacked. She didn't step inside when he opened. "I wasn't going to bring this," she began, then stopped, then started again. "It's postmarked June 7th, 1979. The shape of her mouth made and unmade words before they landed. Addressed to you. He took it without meeting her eyes. The paper rasped, a paper cut of the past. Elise exhaled in the softest reproach. You can't keep chewing on ghosts, she whispered. He wanted to say he was the ghost, Evelyn's college friend. Lonnie Ortiz arrived at the station late like people who never slept properly. She laid a Polaroid on the desk, the kind that keeps its own small darkness worry inside until the picture blooms. Last photo of her, Lonnie said, her voice like someone speaking through winter glass. In the image, Evelyn stood near the cliff railing, hair in a ribboned braid, sky-bruised violet behind her. There was a smudge across the lower edge, a thumbprint perhaps, or a wave caught in the camera's throat. She called you, you know, Lonnie added, not looking at him. The night before. Said you told her to be careful. A pause so long it sprouted meanings. Said you sounded tired. Rowan carried these people like stones in his pockets, the mother who lit a candle that never warmed the room, the pastor whose faith looked like penance, the officer whose innocence wore a mask, the ex who still knew where his refusal to feel slept, the friend who brought an image that wouldn't stop developing. Their voices added up to a chorus of unfinished sentences. Each visit left a residue of air that felt denser than the hour before. He wore it on his skin. He breathed it. He folded it into the folder and called it progress because there was no other word that allowed him to keep moving. At dusk, the town settled as if the earth itself chose to sit down. Porch lights blinked on small eyes keeping watch. The foghorn pulsed its sad arithmetic. Long, short, short, long. In that code, he heard the summons of a life unlearned. When he closed his eyes, he could see Evelyn not as a photograph, but as a habit. A rhythm, the way she wrote in margins, the way she tilted her head when listening, the way she punched truth until it rang like a bell. You keep coming back, Leader had said. He kept coming back because the people who remained had become a map of the person who was missing, and because every map is a confession of the cartographer's desire. Wear a coat, Elise had said, turning to leave. The cold takes what you don't offer. He watched the scarf disappear down the stairs and almost called after her, but some sentences refused to be said aloud. They survive only as breath on a window, dissolving, returning. Dissolving again. 5. Symbolic clues, photos, diary. Patterns build intellectual intrigue. The letter lay on his kitchen table, opened with the old brass opener shaped like a fish. It had a ridiculous weight for something useless. He unfolded it by the sink, where the tap dripped in irregular punctuation. The paper carried the sugared smell of a long-closed drawer. The ink had bled modestly in places, neat handwriting unfurling with the careful ferocity of a disciplined mind. Detective Vale, it began, formal as a column. You asked me to send anything that felt wrong. Everything feels wrong, which I realize is not a useful metric. But patterns are starting to show through the fog if I squint with my whole life. He paused, jaw tightening as if he were biting something he deserved. Evelyn detailed a series of donations funneled through the church building fund during its conversion, amounts that circled themselves in the town's finances like a snake eating its own tail. She listed names with initials as if the envelope might be opened by eyes it wasn't meant for, and drew tiny arrows that made their own community on the page. There were references to a warehouse by the cannery, a coyote lantern ceremony, and a phrase she loved. Negative space tells the story. A note in the margin read, Ask Rowan about the old stairs, if safe. He mouthed the words and felt nothing. Then he felt too much. He spread Evelyn's found objects on his floor. A constellation of the already said and the nearly spoken. Polaroids with fog scrawled across them like white ink. A cassette labeled wind noise test, where his own voice briefly rose from the static. Incredulous, then shrank back into weather. A torn page from a diary with a pressed bit of dune grass that left a faint green tenderness in its wake. In several of the photos, the long exposure of streetlights near the station dragged their light into bars, as if the lens were admitting a truth the eye could not. This place had never stopped being a church, and never stopped being a prison. Patterns emerged if he stared until his focus frayed. Donation dates mapped to storm warnings. Storm warnings mapped to nights the patrols ran thin. Thin patrols mapped to citizens' complaints that evaporated on contact with official paper. Evelyn had been counting the empty spaces between actions. She had been listening to the pauses. In her diary found in a thrift store by accident, or fate impersonating accident, she'd written, "Silence is a sentence without a period. The ending is a matter of belief." Next to it, in darker ink, "Tell R this if I can." R. He pulled an old evidence photo from the archives, the station's backlot in '79, before asphalt clothed it. The ground was a rough quilt of saltbush and sand spurs. There was a faint depression near the foundation, almost a path, almost nothing leading toward the waste pipe where, decades later, they'd dug up the locket. He set the photo beside one of Evelyn's, with streetlights banding into bars. Bars, path, locket. A trinity of absence. The foghorn moaned once, twice, then held its breath. Out on the cliffs, the beacon swung its old compulsion across the black water. He pressed play on the cassette labeled wind noise test. Static rose like a curtain. Then, faintly, a woman laughed, or cried, or both. A male voice had said something too soft to be captured. Only the cadence survived, chastening. Then, a scrape, a clatter, a word like wait or wait. He rewound, replayed, rewound, replayed, until the syllables were stripped of their meanings and became a series of knocks on a locked door. He pinned the diary line to the wall. Silence is a sentence without a period. He wrote beneath it in thick marker, "What did I say?" The answer arrived as a feeling rather than a thought. The old stairs, behind the station's boiler room. Before the conversion, there had been a narrow staircase to a storage loft where hymnals and broken folding chairs slept. He'd interviewed Evelyn there just once, because the front rooms were noisy and the back rooms were full of eyes. He'd promised her anonymity. He'd promised her safety. He'd promised her he would tell her when to stop. Promises are bridges built of sentences without periods. He went back that night, a coward's hour. The stairs still existed, but in secret, boarded over, disguised as wall, reachable through a panel held by two rusted screws that yielded to a pocket knife like men who yield to the inevitable. The loft stank of mice and old wood. Dust motes drifted, illuminated by the flashlight's cone underwater snow. He found a hymn book wrapped in butcher paper. On its flyleaf, in pencil, a hand had written, "Where breath stops, story starts." The handwriting wasn't Evelyn's. It looked like Pastor Reed's, younger and certain. He sat on the step, feeling the slow seep of cold through denim into bone. He remembered the interview. He remembered how he'd been careful to keep distance. He remembered how he had failed at the distance, how her sentences moved like tides and pulled him out past the sandbar. "Do you ever think truth is what we agree to stop questioning?" she had asked. He had laughed then, not unkindly. And then, what had he said? "Careful," he whispered to the dust. "I told you to be careful." The word echoed in the loft and returned misshapen. Careful could mean don't move. It could mean don't speak. It could mean don't continue. It could mean don't trust me to come with you. When he climbed back down, his hands trembled so hard the knife slipped. He tasted the bright iron of himself. Blood dotted the butcher paper like a constellation he couldn't name. He went home and wrote 3 words on the mirror with the side of a charcoal pencil. What if I, the unfinishedness, steadied him? Periods are for the living. Point 6. Twist questions, investigator's perception. Blurring truth and delusion. The arrest moved through town like a siren with no car attached. Just sound and the idea of blue light. Mara Chen signed the paperwork with a hand that looked obedient to its pen. Pastor Auguste read frail, contrite, almost Greek-flag accepted the cuffs with a prayer that was more breath than language. The locket, the ledger copies, the cash trails braided through the church fund. It formed a rope, and everyone pretended not to notice how comfortably it fit around an old man's shoulders. The community was stunned, because that is what communities are designed to be when the familiar is rearranged into a mask. Sealed it yourself? Mara asked Rowan quietly, referring to the evidence bag with the locket. A question wrapped in a question. He nodded without thinking and felt the nod echo louder. In his skull, sleep became a place he visited on a counterfeit passport. He dreamt in Polaroid's images worry into presence too slowly. Moments he could never quite touch because they were still deciding whether to exist. In one, Evelyn turned toward him in the loft, her mouth already forming the word careful. In another, the cliff railing was slick, the fog a living thing. Her braid a rope that could save or condemn depending on when you reached for it. He woke with salt on his lips and couldn't tell if it came from the sea or from himself. He listened to the wind noise test until the tape's ribbon wind. Static made shapes the way clouds do for the lonely. In the hiss, words inserted themselves. He heard his younger voice say, "Stop digging, Evelyn." This town, then a blankness that might have been mercy. He heard nothing this time, only wind. He rewound again. He heard her say, "Rowan, come with me." He rewound again. He heard the staircase creak, as if past and present shared a vertebra. Mercy is a dangerous editor. He visited Leader once more. The candle had burned itself into a shallow dish of white ash. On the table, a cup of tea cooled beside a stack of programs from church fundraisers. Bake sales, raffles, petitions for a new roof. She watched him watch the paper world in which the living pay to keep shelter above their heads. "You found someone to carry this," she said, not accusing, not praising. "Is he the one?" "I don't know what the word one means," he answered. "Leaders, the lamp's light crushed shadows into soft-edged prisons. Do you know what happened to my daughter, detective?" A pause that lasted long enough to grow branches. "Or do you know what happened to you?" He opened his mouth, and the truth scattered like frightened birds. "I told her to be careful," he said. He waited for Leader to strike him with the fact of it. She did not. She touched the rim of the cold cup and closed her eyes. "So did I," she whispered. The dig site behind the station was a wound that had scabbed wrong. Back under a sky like bruised fruit, Rowan stood at the edge and tried to remember whether he had stood here once before with dirt crescents under his nails. Did I bury the locket? The thought slid in, polite, and took a seat. He traced the timeline on the air. June 7th letter. June 8th, graduation night. June 9th, footprints that ended. June 10th, a young detective told to go home and sleep. June 11th, a locket that didn't exist until today. Facts are furniture. We arranged them to make the room survivable. He saw it suddenly, not discovery, but recognition. 2 decades ago, a rookie officer, exhausted, frightened by the suggestion that a pastor and a police fund could share a spine, takes a trinket handed to him in the dark by someone who says, "Found this near the cliffs." Someone he trusts, because trust is easier than admitting you're alone. He pockets it. He plans to log it. He forgets to log it, or he chooses not to log it, because one small thing withheld feels like control. Years crawl. Guilt ferments. The old station becomes a church wearing a badge. Renovation men pry open the ground and bring up his omission, as if it were a time capsule addressed to his throat. He tried to speak this aloud in the squad room. The fluorescent lights hummed their pitch of indifference. "Mara," he said. I think later," she murmured. "The DA wants read by morning." Her whisper was almost kind. "We did it, right? We did it." The words hung like a medal around a neck that had no place to put it. He watched the coffee drip and thought of blood leaving the body slow enough to confess. He went home and opened the diary again, searching for any place where Evelyn had written his name in a way that resembled blame. Instead, he found a page he had mistuck to another by static or fate. "If I vanish, do not build a statue of me," she had written. "Build a mirror and put it in the place where I'm missing. Whoever looks will see the suspect." He held the page up to the hallway light. The pencil gleamed like the idea of metal. He drove to the cliffs, the dumbest pilgrimage. Fog sat heavy as unspoken apology. The ocean skin shivered. He placed the diary on the railing and imagined it leaping. "Evelyn," he said, almost unheard, "if the truth is only what we agree to stop questioning, what happens if I never agree?" The sea answered with its one talent, removal. When the news broke, a case solved. Pastor arrested, the community performed its shock, and his name was left out of the first drafts. He watched himself not mentioned and felt the relief of a man whose tumor is benign but growing. The twist was not in the headline, not in the handcuffs, not in the paper trail. It was lodged in his own vestibular system, the part that keeps a body upright in gravity. He could no longer tell whether the world tilted or he did. Memory is a lens that remembers what it wants to see. He could have told her to stop. He could have told her to go. Both could be true if he needed them to be. At 3 a.m, he picked up the phone to call the DA, to tell her that the rope fit his shoulders, too. He set the phone down and waited for judgment to arrive as thunder. Instead, only the refrigerator clicked and hummed. That domestic machinery that keeps us alive while we decide what we deserve. He slept at last, and in the dream the fog parted just enough to reveal 2 people standing at the railing, Evelyn and a man with his face. She turned to him and said nothing. He turned to her and said nothing. Between them, the locket hung in the air, undecided about gravity, deciding only how to shine. 7 ending feels haunting, and unresolved truth brings no peace. The courtroom smelled like new carpeter lie laid down over older lies. Cameras blinked in synchronized astonishment. Pastor Reed pled guilty to lesser things and not guilty to the one that mattered. The DA built a bridge out of receipts and called it justice. The town crossed because the alternative was water. Leader Maren sat in the second row, her hands folded into one another until they agreed to be still. When Rowan entered at the back, sound found him slowly, like tide creeping up a flat shore. He didn't testify. He carried his honesty like an overfull glass. Careful steps, eyes on the rim, too aware of how little movement it took to spill. He told himself he would speak if asked. He was not asked. The silence absolved no one dot. Outside, the sky pressed a bruised thumb on the horizon. A gull argued with its reflection on a courthouse window. Across the street, a florist set out buckets of chrysanthemums with the casual industry of someone who knew grief to be repeat business. Mara Chen stood under the awning, reading a phone she didn't enjoy. When she saw him, she tucked it away like contraband. "It's done," she said softly. "The town can sleep." "Has it ever?" he asked. She looked at him, then at the grey, then back. "You look different," she said, "which is how people say you look like a man who left something unanswered in the house he lives in." She added, "You did what you could." The way someone places a blanket over a body that is still breathing. He walked the familiar route to the station, past clapboard houses that leaned at the same angle, past an antique store window full of clocks stopped at disparate catastrophes. Inside, the station had the bright fatigue of an office after a storm, everything upright. Everything a little more itself because it survived. The loft stairs hid behind their disguised wall, breathing their sawdust breath. He pressed his palm flat to the panel, the way believers pressed the page of a sacred text. He felt the wood cool, an indifferent underskin that might as well have belonged to anyone in his apartment. The mirror still carried the unfinished sentence. What if I, the charcoal, had smeared, softening the letters into a weather report? He considered completing it. He didn't. He stood very still and listened to the building's sounds, the elevator clinically clearing its throat, the neighbor's television whispering a show about people whose problems ended every hour. He opened the window. The city's long exhale drifted in. A ship horn, low and patient, hauled its shape through fog. He laid Evelyn's letter on the table, the diary beside it, the Polaroid cupping its permanent storm. He added the hymn book flyleaf with Pastor Reed's pencil scripture, "Where breath stops, story starts." He thought of Leader's candle, burned down to a circle of salt. He thought of Elisa's scarf disappearing in the stairwell. He thought of his young voice on tape saying something that could be mercy or murder depending on who needed sleep. He thought of the locket that had waited underground until men with shovels performed birth. He dialed the DA and let the number ring once, twice, 3 times. He hung up. He dialed Lida. He hung up. He dialed his own voicemail and listened to the empty greeting until it sounded like someone else's confession. At dusk, he went to the cliffs one. Last time, last meaning today. The rail was cold, the fog uncommitted, the ocean doing exactly what it had been hired to do. He held the diary over the water, then pulled it back. He slipped the Polaroid into his pocket, as if he was stealing something small and impossible to sell. He closed his eyes so he could see her face the way absence taught him, first in fragments, then as a whole, then as a fragment again. A couple walked by holding hands. Their conversation in fragments, the price of fish, the patience of fathers, the uncertain weather. "Careful," the woman said, laughing, and the word came to him as if the wind had brought it from 1979, with its original salt still wet on the consonants. He stepped back and let them pass without becoming their story. On the drive home, the radio found a station between stations, white noise that felt like tide. He left it there, in the impossible hour when days borrow light from one another. He parked and sat in the dark until the car forgot it was a car and remembered it was a room that moved. He thought of Evelyn not as a missing person, but as a verb. To Evelyn is to widen the aperture until darkness has its say. When the press release arrived, cold case closed, he read it once, then folded it until the words disappeared inside their own corners. He slid it into the drawer where he kept spare keys and promises he had no right to keep. He washed his hands, the ritual for men who cannot baptize themselves. He turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway listening to the room settle. The refrigerator clicked. The drip in the sink stalled between drops. A siren passed somewhere far away, neither arriving nor receding. The mirror waited, its sentence still without a period. He raised the charcoal stub, then lowered it. He whispered into the dim that smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleanser, "I keep coming back." The room accepted the words and filed them with the others. He lay down without expecting sleep. In the next room, the wall clock kept time the way a wound keeps weather. He thought of the town, sleeping or pretending to. He thought of the pastor, a man who had not only sinned but aged. He thought of Leda's hands, folded. He thought of Mara's whisper, almost kind. He thought of the locket, patient underground, waiting for the day the earth would be asked to speak. If peace arrived, it arrived as air present, invisible, necessary, and insufficient. He breathed it anyway. The case was solved. He was not. The window, opened to fingers, admitted the low moan of the foghorn and the higher hinge squeak of someone else's door. Between those sounds, a third tone, neither out there nor in here, held the room. It was not music. It was not language. It was the weight of truth moving from one silence to another, and he recognized it like a face glimpsed in a broken mirror, whole only when you stand exactly where the fracture wants you. He stood there as long as he could. Then he looked away.